When we think of serial killers, right, we often picture like Hollywood's version, the criminal masterminds, always kind of like on the move, elusive. But what's the reality actually look like? Today we're diving into this research on critical characteristics of male serial murderers to, separate fact from fiction.
And as I think you'll discover, the reality is often way more complex and nuanced than any fictional portrayal.
Yeah, absolutely. So to start, let's just address the elephant in the room, defining serial murder. It's not as straightforward as you might think.
No, not at all. There's actually no universally agreed upon definition, right? Some researchers, they focus on the cooling off period between murders. Others emphasize the number of victims. And then the role of motivation, particularly sexual gratification, that's a whole other gray area.
Yeah, it's almost like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
Right, trying to find this like one-size-fits-all definition for something as complex as serial murder.
Exactly. And this lack of a clear definition, it has real-world implications. It influences how these crimes are investigated, how they're portrayed in the media, all of that.
So how does this research study define it? What's their sort of starting point?
Well, in this particular study, they used a combination of factors to identify their subject group. They focused on individuals who had committed at least 2 murders with a significant cooling off period between them.
Interesting. So they are acknowledging that there needs to be a distinction between, say, a mass shooting and then a string of individual murders that happen over time.
Exactly. And that distinction, it's crucial because it speaks to the psychology of the offender, right? A serial killer, they're not driven by the same kind of like immediate explosive rage that you might see in a mass shooting. There's premeditation, there's planning, and often a very, very complex psychological motive at play.
And speaking of psychology, this study uses something called the trauma control model to try to kind of get inside the minds of these killers. And you probably heard the phrase, hurt people, hurt people. How much do you think that applies in these cases?
That phrase, while simplistic, it does kind of hint at a chilling truth. That's often revealed when you look at the life histories of serial killers. The trauma control model, it basically says that early childhood trauma, things like abuse, neglect, they can have a profound and devastating impact on an individual's development, their sense of self.
So essentially these early experiences of powerlessness and this lack of control, they can manifest in really horrific ways later in life.
Exactly, yeah. The model suggests that these individuals, they might develop violent fantasies as a coping mechanism. Fantasies where they're the ones in control, they're inflicting the pain, they're asserting their dominance. And for some, these fantasies, they become a dangerous obsession. And eventually, they spill over into reality.
So it's a gradual escalation. It's from these disturbing thoughts to like try out crimes and then ultimately to murder.
In a sense, yeah. The act of killing, it becomes a perverse form of self-medication, this temporary and horrifically misguided attempt to reclaim that sense of power and control that was taken from them.
Yeah, it's incredibly disturbing. And it makes you think about that common misconception that all serial killers are, these criminal masterminds. This study really challenges that notion, doesn't it?
It does. While many serial killers, they do have prior criminal records, surprisingly few have actually sought treatment for mental health issues before that first kill.
So the signs might be there, but they're often going unnoticed or misinterpreted.
Exactly. And it really highlights a crucial point about the limitations of profiling. We tend to focus on the outward characteristics, the behaviors, but the why, those underlying psychological factors, are often far more complex and much harder to detect.
It's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg with these outward characteristics.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why this kind of research is so valuable, right? It goes beyond those surface level characteristics, and it really delves into the data, challenging a lot of these preconceived notions we might have. Like you mentioned age earlier. It's easy to picture, a seasoned criminal when we think about serial killers. But what did the research actually show?
Well, this study found that the average age of these guys when they committed their first kill was 26, which I don't know about you, but that's younger than I think a lot of people would guess.
Yeah, for sure. It's a stark reminder that this isn't some phenomenon confined to the shadows, right? This is happening within a relatively young demographic. And it raises the question, like, what is going on in the lives of these individuals that would lead them down this path at such a young age?
Right. And then there's the whole issue of ethnicity, which is another area where I think stereotypes often kind of cloud our judgment.
Yeah, you're right. Media representation really shapes our perception of who serial killers are. So let's talk about that. Ethnicity. This study found that while the majority of the subjects were Caucasian, a significant percentage, 16%, were African American.
Which really shows you how dangerous it can be to rely on stereotypes, right? It's not as simple as someone fitting a certain profile. It's about understanding this complex kind of interplay of individual and societal factors.
Absolutely. And this is where we need to be careful about drawing too many conclusions from a single study, right? The underrepresentation of Hispanic and Asian individuals in this particular research, it raises questions about, potential biases in how cases are identified. We need more diverse data sets for sure.
Right, like we're only seeing one small piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Exactly. But even within this one piece, the variety in how these individuals operate their killing careers, as this study calls it, is fascinating. For example, we often imagine serial killers claiming like dozens of victims over many years, but is that really the case?
Not according to this research, no.
Yeah.
While the average number of victims is higher than you might think, the median was 6, the length of their careers is actually really short. We're talking a median of just 1 year.
Wow. See, that's a really crucial detail. It kind of challenges this whole idea of the mastermind, playing this long game, evading capture for years. This shorter time frame, it might suggest that the frequency of the killings, not just this prolonged pursuit, is a key factor in them ultimately getting caught.
That's an interesting point. It's like the faster they escalate, the more likely they are to slip up, which is, I guess, in a grim way, kind of a hopeful thing to consider.
It is, yeah. Now let's dig into another area where this research really challenges some of the common assumptions, and that's the role of sexual motivation. We often associate, serial killing with sexual violence, but the reality, as usual, is much more nuanced.
Right. It's not always about the act itself, but the power dynamic, I think.
Exactly, yeah. And the study actually found that while about half of these cases did involve some form of sexual activity, there were some really important distinctions between the ones that were classified as sexually motivated and the ones that weren't.
And this is where I think the study takes a really fascinating turn. What did they find about the specifics of these crimes?
Well, for one thing, the guys who were identified as sexually motivated, they were way more likely to have those prior criminal records we talked about earlier.
So there's already a greater tendency toward, like, risk-taking behavior, criminal behavior in general.
Right, exactly. And when it came to the murders themselves, the study revealed some pretty disturbing stuff. Something like 69% of the sexually motivated killers, they preferred using hands-on methods. Like they really craved that direct personal control over their victims.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that for some of these guys, the act itself it's almost like it's intertwined with this need for power and domination.
Absolutely. And that desire for control, it often extended to, the relationship, or rather lack thereof, with the victim. The sexually motivated killers were more likely to target strangers, individuals they had zero prior connection to.
It's like they're dehumanizing the victims in their minds, seeing them as objects, not actual people.
That's a pretty accurate way to put it, honestly. Although here's a really unexpected finding within that sexually motivated group. The ones who targeted men, they actually had a significantly higher victim count than those who targeted women.
Wow, that's a huge finding. It really challenges some of those assumptions we have about the motivations behind these types of crimes. Do they have any theories about why that might be?
That's a question that demands a lot more research, really. It could be, societal factors at play, cultural norms, maybe even differences in how these crimes are investigated or prosecuted. But it just goes to show you that you can't make generalizations about offenders based solely on, their perceived sexual preferences. There's a lot more to unpack there.
It's a good reminder that there's always more to the story, right?
Yeah.
And I guess speaking of unpacking things, there's this other aspect of serial killing that we haven't even touched on yet. The fact that not all of these guys work alone.
You're talking about team killing, which this research actually delved into that as well. They found that 16% of the killers in their sample, they worked in pairs.
That's almost more disturbing in a way. To think about two people collaborating on these horrific acts.
Yeah.
Like, it just adds this whole other layer to trying to understand the motivations. Did they find any differences between those team killers and the ones who worked alone?
It's interesting. They actually found that the team killers, they tended to resemble the non-sexually motivated offenders more. like in their choice of victim, their killing methods. It's almost as if that dynamic of the partnership, having that shared responsibility, maybe it somehow changes the motivations or just how those motivations manifest themselves.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what that dynamic does to like their mindset. But I think it's important to shift gears a little bit here. We talked a lot about, the perpetrators, their characteristics, but we can't forget about the victims and all of this.
Absolutely, yeah. The focus of this research is definitely on the killers themselves, what makes them tick. But we have to remember that behind all these statistics, every data point, we're talking about a human life that was tragically cut short.
It's easy to get caught up in all the psychology, the details of the crimes, the investigation, trying to figure out the why.
Yeah.
But we can never lose sight of the human cost, right?
Well said. And I think one of the most heartbreaking findings from all of this research was just how many of these victims were unknown to their killer. Like the vast majority, we're talking 87%.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It speaks to this randomness, this idea that anyone, anywhere, could just cross paths with someone capable of this kind of violence.
It's a sobering thought for sure. And it makes you think about the larger societal context, right? Like, are there things about our culture, our institutions that might contribute to an environment where this kind of violence can happen?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? And I don't know that there are any easy answers, but I do think this research offers some potential clues, especially when we circle back to that trauma control model.
Yeah, I mean, that model, it suggests that, these guys, these killers, they often have this cluster of traits, a history of childhood trauma, a fascination with violence, that need for control that we talked about, a lack of empathy.
So it's not just one red flag. It's like this combination of things that might, when they're all present, signal a higher risk.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing patterns, not jumping to conclusions based on any one behavior. But of course, this is where things get so complicated, because these issues, especially in childhood, they often go unnoticed, or even when they are noticed, they're not dealt with.
It's a sad truth. Like the very experiences that might make someone vulnerable to going down this path are often the ones that people don't want to talk about.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important, right? We have to be able to talk about these things. Mental health, trauma, the warning signs of violence. We need to create a society where people, young people especially, feel safe coming forward, asking for help for themselves or for someone they're worried about.
Early intervention, creating those support systems. That's where I think we find a glimmer of hope in all of this.
I agree. We can't undo the tragedies that have already happened, but maybe by understanding these crimes better, by addressing those root causes, we can create a different kind of future, a future where these things happen less often.
Well, this deep dive has certainly been a journey. We've really gone to some dark places, but these are important conversations to have.
Knowledge is power, right? Even when it's hard to hear. By shining a light on these difficult subjects, these uncomfortable truths, we can start to make more informed decisions as individuals, as a society.
We've explored the dark world of serial murder, going way beyond the stereotypes and the headlines to really try to understand these complex psychological factors at play. And while there are definitely still a lot of unanswered questions, I think this research gives us some very valuable insights into a phenomenon that, let's face it, it frightens us, but it also fascinates us.
It does. And if there's one key takeaway from all of this, I think it's that, there are rarely easy answers when it comes to human behavior. Things are complicated. But by embracing that complexity, by acknowledging the nuances, that's how we can have more productive conversations about violence.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for going on this journey with me today. It's been heavy at times, but illuminating. And to our listeners, thank you for being willing to delve into these difficult topics with us. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.